Please allow me to call on stage Mr. Jose Fernandez, the Undersecretary for Economic Growth, Energy and the Environment for the Department of State for the United States of America, to deliver his keynote. Welcome.
So I'm going to take a page from our host. Good morning. Good morning. Great. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me to be here. Let me start by expressing my gratitude to the International Trade Center for this opportunity to speak at the World Export Development Forum on trends in international trade. Can you hear me now? I also would like to thank the Mongolian government and people for welcoming us to this beautiful country that I've had a chance to visit now for the last couple of days. As Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment at the State Department, one of my most important goals is promoting international trade. And so today what I'd like to do is, for the next 10 minutes or so, discuss three key trends. Number one, resilient trade. Secondly, sustainable trade, and third, green trade. Let me start with some context, some brief context. I'm not a government official by training. I've been in and out of government now for the last 10, 15 years, and I first entered government service during the Obama administration. When I returned to government this time in 2021, I saw cracks in the international economic order that the United States and our partners had built over the last 7 decades. The system of trade that had been built up that had benefited a number of our countries was starting to show cracks. We faced a new environment of geopolitical and security competition. We saw an accelerating climate crisis, and consequently, we also saw the need for an energy transition. The United States and our economic domestic policy has responded to these challenges and is helping to shape the future of international trade. This includes massive domestic policy and spending initiatives under new laws, such as the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. But at the same time that the U.S. focuses on domestic policy, we remain one of the most open and competitive economies in the world, as reflected in our trade statistics. Compared to the pre-pandemic numbers in 2018, for example, in 2022, last year, total U.S. trade had grown by 23% by value, with goods trade up 27% and services up 12%. These are record levels. U.S. tariffs are among the lowest in the world. In fact, as I work now on our America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, APEP, we're finding that average tariffs in Latin America from the U.S. are less than 1%. What does that show you? It shows you that economic development is more than simply about trade. It shows you that it's about improving the investment climate, ensuring transparency and good regulations, eliminating corruption, and ensuring that the benefits of economic growth permeate to all sectors of society. That's how you promote trade. According to UNCTAD, the United States continues to attract the largest inward flow of foreign direct investment at almost $368 billion. Total stock of foreign direct investment in 2021 stood at almost $14 trillion. The U.S. is also the world's largest foreign investor with FDI outward stock of almost $10 trillion. As these figures underscore, the openness of the U.S. economy to goods and services remains a critical driver of world economic growth, higher living standards, and sustainable development. International institutions are critical, and we remain committed to the WTO and its key principles, the principles of fair competition, openness, transparency, and the rule of law. However, we recognize that serious challenges are posed by non-market policies and practices that have undermined the WTO. And so we're working with other WTO members to reform the multilateral trading system so that it benefits workers, so that it accommodates legitimate national security interests, and that it also addresses pressing issues like intellectual property theft, sustainable development, and the clean energy transition. I see three emerging trends that I'd like to focus on that present opportunities for the United States and our global trading partners in these fast-changing times. And let me just touch upon them very briefly. I'd like to talk about resilient trade, sustainable trade, and green trade. Let me explain what we mean by resilient trade. The COVID-19 pandemic led to fluctuations in demand that produced a dramatic recession, and that also, and I hope we can still remember this because it's gonna come back, that stretched our supply chains to the breaking point. We learned that shutdowns in China, for example, could lead to shortages of medical equipment in Malaysia, that could lead to shortages of medical equipment in the United States. We've worked with a growing network of partners as a result to make supply chains and global trade more resilient. For example, last July, the United States hosted a supply chain ministerial, and since then, 28 economies have endorsed a joint statement that outlines 4 key principles of supply chain resilience: transparency, diversification, security, and sustainability. And we welcome partner governments' consideration in growing this growing community by endorsing the statement. We're also working with trading partners to build resilience through a range of mechanisms. These include the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, the TTC, where we cooperate on semiconductors and critical minerals and clean energy supply chains. For example, in the TTC, in the Trade and Technology Council, we've established early warning systems for semiconductor manufacturing in order to identify supply chain vulnerabilities before these vulnerabilities materialize. Last month, 14 members of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework reached substantial conclusion of negotiations on the landmark supply chain agreement that will support trade by monitoring and responding to supply chain crises. And through the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity, APEP, we are aiming to leverage our geographic proximity and deepen trade in the Western Hemisphere in order to further strengthen supply chains. The second trend that I'd like to just mention briefly is sustainable trade. For trade to be sustainable, it has to contribute to environmental protection. As trading partners, all of us should strive for high levels of environmental protection and effectively enforce our environmental laws. This includes addressing marine litter, plastics pollution, and fishery subsidies, and also air and water quality, wildlife protection, illegal logging, and biodiversity. Simply put, sustainable trade also levels the playing field for all of us. Sustainability also includes sustainable labor practices that ensure that workers, as well as employers, benefit from trade. This means including effective measures to improve the goods trade, to prohibit goods trade made with forced labor, and the elimination of forced labor domestically. None of us can and none of us wants to compete in trade with goods made with forced labor. In addition, trading partners have to adopt and enforce internationally recognized labor rights in their domestic labor laws, including freedom of association and collective bargaining. Governments need to hold companies accountable when an entity violates labor laws. These are big steps for a number of economies around the world, and we in the US want to collaborate constructively through capacity building and sharing best practices with our partners. Sustainability issues can also be addressed in new legislation such as our Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, through provisions in free trade agreements, and increasingly through due diligence efforts promoted by governments and industry. This is a trend that is likely to continue, and that you're seeing in fora such as the OECD, which is taking up a due diligence framework, which is something that we have been supporting now for several years. In our own trade agreements, for example, in the US-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement, we've provided for our governments to engage in consultations when labor unions believe that employers have violated their labor standards. Macroeconomic growth, simply put, cannot be pursued at the expense of labor rights. Finally, let me just touch upon the third trend, green trade. We know that the climate crisis and that the energy transition requires urgent action by all of our governments. Through the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed last year and through the bipartisan infrastructure law that was also passed last year, the U.S. has taken action to drive innovation, to reduce costs, and to accelerate development of new green technologies. We're catalyzing private investment in green infrastructure, including $137 billion in electric vehicles and batteries, and $84 billion in clean energy, such as wind and solar power. This is the challenge of our time, and the U.S. and the Biden administration has taken on this challenge head on. Where investment flows, trade follows. We've worked closely with our trading partners to communicate how our public investments need to be at the center of the energy transition. We're aligning our incentives with Europe. We've signed an agreement on critical minerals cooperation with Japan, and we've launched negotiations with the EU and the United Kingdom on critical minerals cooperation. Earlier this week, right here in Mongolia, the US, Mongolia, and the Republic of Korea held a trilateral meeting on critical minerals, which is both an opportunity, a generational opportunity for many countries, but also a strategic imperative for all of us if we are going to reach our clean energy goals. Yesterday, in fact, we took a next step with the US and Mongolia signing an MOU that I was proud to witness in order to deepen cooperation in this sector. So let me conclude. The movements towards resilient trade, sustainable trade, and green trade are clearly shaping the international trading environment of the future. Through a policy focus on the three trends, we in the United States want to make trade work for all of our stakeholders, including industry and including labor. And we also want to ensure that trade contributes to inclusive global growth. So thank you for your time. Thank you for allowing me to provide a few remarks. I'm glad to be part of this conversation, and I hope to be part of this conversation going forward on these and other trends shaping our energy future. Thank you very much.